Democrats officially now have maintained the House by a slim margin, but for the third cycle in a row, they failed to take a majority in the Senate. And yet, according to Politico, major leadership changes in the party seem unlikely.
And in the meantime, progressives and moderates are playing the blame game over Election Day losses. With us to discuss the party's infighting is contributing editor to Current Affairs, former National Press Secretary for the Sanders campaign, co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray herself. Good to see you, Briahna. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
So what do you make of this breakdown? We got Politico stories about Democrats are depressed about their brand. They think that the country thinks of them as demons themselves. Spanberger is going after AOC, Connor Lamb, and then Rashida Tlaib firing back. Just lay it out for us. What do you think the battle lines are? And I mean, I think we know where you fall, but in general, why do you think that either or argument has merit?
Look, the narrative that's being pushed just simply doesn't align with the facts. The Democrats in swing districts that backed policies like Medicare for All won. The Democrats who didn't, 6 Democrats in swing districts who declined to back Medicare for All lost. And I just want everyone to dig deep and imagine what kind of narrative would be being pushed right now if Bernie Sanders were at the top of a ticket and the party experienced the kind of failures it experienced last Tuesday. There would be no doubt the top of the ticket would be blamed for kind of down ballot underperformance, especially when you look at the extent to which progressive policies outpaced the party performance across the country. Most notably, I think, when you look at Florida and the $15 minimum wage, which passed with over 60% of votes when Joe Biden wasn't able to take the state. And yet, Democratic moderates, corporate Democrats, never missed an opportunity to punch left and blame the base of the party, the base that actually managed to turn out crucial voters in crucial states, the door-knocking efforts of people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar in their respective states that really pulled Joe Biden across the edge. And instead of being grateful, what we see is this kind of infighting.
Yeah. I mean, Briahna, the one place where I do think they have a point is, look, it is true the Democratic Party brand is terrible. I just don't think it's for the reasons that they necessarily think. Is, as you point out, especially where progressive economic policies, marijuana legalization was dramatically popular in Oregon. They decriminalized all drugs. In Florida, of course, 60% backed a $15 minimum wage. And we've seen the polling about how overwhelmingly popular progressive economic policies in particular are. Fox News had a exit poll that had 72% of voters saying yes to government public health care. So why do you think that the Democratic Party brand in and of itself is such a drag on every single candidate associated with it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, one thing is that folks pointed out that for as much as there were right-wing commercials about socialism, there were many, many, many right-wing commercials trying to associate candidates with Nancy Pelosi, who is deeply unpopular, right? So you could just as well attribute the failures down ballot to the association with the kind of same old corporate Dem brand, which I think is unpopular because it's gone for decades now without being able to show demonstrably really meaningful changes in people's lives. And that's why I think it's really kind of remarkable, really special what AOC is doing right now, branding the successes of progressives in this last election cycle with this new hashtag, Embrace the Base, and creating visual guides for folks so they can see the real facts on the ground about how and where progressive policies succeeded. The blame game is really disappointing also because there's a lot of cherry picking of facts. Also doesn't really reflect the extent to which Democratic Party underinvests in winnable states. So right now it's talking about the uphill battle that it faces in the South, in Georgia. And, you know, there's this political piece talking about how candidates like Mike Espy in Mississippi have faced the same kind of uphill battle. But I reported on Mississippi back in 2018 when I was at The Intercept, when there were 2 Senate seats up for grabs in Mississippi as well. And the Democratic Party dramatically underinvested in that state, despite the fact that they talk so much about how much they care about Black voters, so much about how they care about the base of the party. But Mississippi is the blackest state in the union, where you only need to win between 11 and 25% of white voters to win there. And yet the Republicans outspent Democrats 4-1 in the state that year. So who really is to blame when you look at the numbers?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting also to break it down in that coalition and more, Briahna. I think you make an excellent point there, which is, I mean, I think it's funny. I hit progressives here too. But I'm like, look, the idea that Abigail Spanberger and Nancy Pelosi are popular is insane, right? I mean, I've said this before, which is that their impeachment strategy actually led in January to the highest part of the electorate identifying as Republican in modern history since George W. Bush times. Now, if they hadn't had COVID, they would have been screwed. And I think that's something they're really not reckoning with.
Yeah, look, we're living at a time of peak political dissatisfaction. And I think political disaffection was largely driving the interest in Trump in the first place. Every election cycle of my lifetime has been a contest between a candidate that has branded themselves as a more establishment candidate and a candidate that brands themselves as the outsider. And again, the outsider candidate wins. Now, I think that part of why we have had such a nail-biter this election cycle is that Donald Trump's ability to brand himself as an outsider who can bring change to Washington and drain the swamp is dramatically undermined by the fact that he is an incumbent and is responsible for the last 4 years and, of course, for the poor response to the COVID crisis. But Joe Biden also has a real struggle in branding himself as anything other than an establishment figure himself, obviously, as a former vice president who was running on nothing will fundamentally change. So we got a lot of people checked out of this election cycle, and they were really driven to vote only by fact that Donald Trump is perceived as monstrous and a genuine threat to democracy.
Yeah, right. I think that's right. Lastly, Briahna, I wanted to ask you about, there's a new report in the Times about Sunrise and Justice Democrats teaming up to issue a list of progressive appointees they'd like to see put in key Joe Biden cabinet positions. Among those, Bernie Sanders as Labor Secretary, Elizabeth Warren as Treasury Secretary. But they've got a whole list of folks that I think would be a lot better from you and I's perspective than what the Biden administration is very likely to go forward with. But how useful do you think that these efforts are? And even within progressive circles, I've actually seen some conflicting views about whether they would even want Bernie Sanders as Labor Secretary or want to keep him in the Senate. What's your view on all of that?
It depends on what Sunrise is willing to do. Now, I think people who know me know that I was a big advocate of making these kinds of asks, making hard demands before Joe Biden was elected, because at this point, there is very little you can do to coerce Joe Biden to, concede to your demands. But Sunrise has been known to take their protests to Nancy Pelosi's office and to be able to make a great deal of fuss and draw a lot of public scrutiny to politicians through their activist efforts. So even if they can't really threaten Joe Biden from kind of an electoral perspective, they can certainly make things difficult and embarrassing for him in the public sphere. And given what's at stake, I think they absolutely should. Prior to this list, I saw among the names floated for a Joe Biden administration, Amy Klobuchar for Attorney General. This is the woman whose VP chances were largely, shall we say, shot in the leg by the fact that she failed to prosecute the officer that went on to kill George Floyd, right? In the middle of the protests going on this summer, the VP picks were going on, and that was something that was seen as really detrimental to her viability as a VP pick. And now she's being offered up to be the, top cop, if you will, of the United States. And I think it's a really out of touch moment for the Biden campaign. And I hope that activists of all stripes are able to exert a kind of pressure that will keep the Joe Biden administration more in line with the public that got him elected.
Certainly see. Thank you, Briahna. Thank you for joining us.
Always great to see you, Briahna. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, what happened with the polls this year? We've got some theories, some new data to back up some ideas of what may have gone wrong. We'll talk about all of that when Rising continues.